The realtor's office smelled of expensive perfume and saltwater, a peculiar blend that reminded me of overpriced coastal property and life-altering decisions. I sat across from Claire Matthews, her manicured nails clicking against her tablet screen as she delivered the news that would shatter the foundation of my 15-year marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My wife had listed our beloved Seafoam Cottage for sale, only she wasn't legally authorized to sell it, and someone else's name was on the deed. "Mr. Harrington, I have your grandfather's paperwork right here," Claire said, sliding a folder across her glass-topped desk. Outside her panoramic windows, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, sunlight dancing across the waves. According to county records, Seafoam Cottage was officially transferred to you 6 months ago, following Theodore Harrington's passing. I nodded, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest whenever I thought about Grandpa Theo. The cottage had been his sanctuary for over 50 years, a weathered blue craftsman perched on the bluffs of Cape Haven. He'd spent his retirement there, painting seascapes and teaching me to fish off the private dock that extended like a wooden finger into the bay. As you know, beachfront property in this area has skyrocketed in value, Claire continued, her voice bright with professional enthusiasm. Even a modest home like Seafoam is now worth north of $3 million. "It's not for sale," I said, perhaps too sharply. I softened my tone. "Sorry, Claire. I appreciate your time, but I wanted to be clear. I have no intention of selling my grandfather's house." Claire's perfectly arched eyebrows pulled together in confusion. She glanced down at her tablet, then back at me. "That's odd. According to our system, Seafoam Cottage was listed 3 days ago by Elise Harrington. Your wife, correct?" The room seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the armrests of my chair, feeling as though the floor might drop away. "That's impossible. Elise doesn't have the authority to list the property." Claire's expression shifted to one of professional concern. "Mr. Harrington, Ryan, there seems to be some confusion. Your wife provided documentation showing she had power of attorney and joint ownership rights. She's already accepted a preliminary offer from Coastal Developments LLC. My thoughts spun like a riptide. Elise and I had been having problems. Her constant pressure to sell the cottage, her cryptic late-night phone calls, her weekend conferences that never seemed to have any associated paperwork. But this was something else entirely. This was betrayal pure and simple. "Show me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Claire turned her tablet toward me. There it was, a professional listing for Seafoam Cottage, complete with drone footage of the property and interior photos I'd never seen before. Photos that had been taken without my knowledge. The listing agent was Claire's colleague, Dominic Walsh. The asking price, $3.5 million. "When was the last time you spoke with your wife about this property?" Claire asked carefully. 2 weeks ago, I replied, my mouth dry. She brought up selling again. I said no. Again. Claire hesitated, then pulled another document from her folder. She provided this power of attorney document, dated last year. It appears to have your signature. I took the paper, studying it closely. The signature did look like mine. Close enough to fool someone who didn't know better, but I had never signed such a document. Never. "This is forged," I said quietly. Claire's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Harrington." "It's the truth." I handed the document back to her. "And there's something else you should know. My grandfather's will had a specific clause. Seafoam Cottage cannot be sold for at least 5 years after his death. He wanted to ensure it remained in the family." Claire frowned, making a note. "That restriction should have been flagged in our system. Let me check something." She typed rapidly, her expression growing more concerned. "There's no mention of such a restriction in the paperwork that was filed." Just the deed transfer to you. A cold realization washed over me. When did Elise provide these documents? 3 days ago. She came in with Dominic. They seemed quite familiar with each other. Another piece clicked into place. Dominic Walsh. The same Dominic who had been Elise's college boyfriend before we met. The same Dominic who had mysteriously reappeared in our lives 6 months ago as a business contact of Elise's marketing firm. Claire, I said, fighting to keep my voice level, I need copies of everything Elise submitted, and I need to speak with your managing broker immediately. Of course, she replied, clearly sensing the gravity of the situation. But Ryan, if what you're saying is true, this is beyond a real estate dispute. This is fraud. I'm aware, I said, pulling out my phone. No messages from Elise, which wasn't surprising. She'd told me she was in Chicago for a marketing conference. Another lie, apparently. As Claire left to speak with her broker, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed. Marcus Harrington, my cousin and a criminal defense attorney in Portland. I'd need legal help, and quickly. Before I could make the call, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ryan, you need to stop asking questions about Seafoam. Elise knows what she's doing. This is bigger than you understand. D. Dominic. So he was monitoring the situation. I felt a surge of anger, followed by determination. Whatever game they were playing, they had made a critical mistake. They thought I was alone in this, that I would discover the listing after it was too late, that I would be forced to accept their fait accompli. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had prepared for this very scenario. 2 nights before he died, Grandpa. Theo had called me to his bedside at Seafoam. The winter wind howled outside, sending sea spray against the windows, while a fire crackled in the stone hearth. Ryan, he'd said, his once booming voice now barely above a whisper, there's something I need to tell you about this house. I had leaned closer, thinking he wanted to share some sentimental memory or family history. Instead, he'd pressed a small brass key into my palm. Under the floorboards in my studio, the loose one by the north window. What you'll find there will protect Seafoam when I'm gone. I'd been confused. Protected from what, Grandpa? His blue eyes, still sharp despite his failing health, had fixed on mine. From those who see only dollar signs when they look at it. Promise me you'll keep it safe, Ryan. This place is more than just property. I had promised, tucking the key into my wallet. After the funeral, in the chaos of grief and arrangements, I'd forgotten about it entirely. Until now. Claire returned with her broker, a stern-looking woman named Beverly Winters, who listened to my explanation with increasing concern. This is a legal nightmare, Beverly said finally. We'll freeze the listing immediately pending investigation, but you need to understand, if your wife and Dominic have already accepted funds from Coastal Developments, this could get very complicated. Very quickly. I understand, I said, standing up. Thank you for your help. I need to get to the cottage. What will you do? Claire asked, concern evident in her voice. I thought of Grandpa Theo's key, still in my wallet after all these months. I'm going to find proof that Seafoam was never meant to be sold, and then I'm going to find out why my wife was so desperate to sell it that she would commit fraud. As I drove along the coastal highway toward Cape Haven, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, another text came through. Too late, Ryan. Papers already signed. Demolition starts next week. Nothing personal, just business. Demolition. The word hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just selling Seafoam, they were planning to destroy it. Coastal Developments was known for buying up historic properties, raising them, and building gaudy McMansions in their place. My grandfather's beloved cottage, with its handcrafted details and century of history, would be reduced to splinters and memories. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the ocean a blur of blue to my right. Whatever Grandpa Theo had hidden under, those floorboards, I needed to find it now, before Elise or Dominic realized I was onto them. Before they could cover their tracks, as I crested the final hill and Seafoam came into view, its weathered blue boards glowing in the afternoon sun, I felt a fierce resolve harden within me. This wasn't just about property or money anymore. This was about honor, truth, and the promise I'd made to a dying man. I was about to discover just how far my wife had gone to betray me, and just how thoroughly my grandfather had outsmarted her. I pulled into the gravel driveway of Seafoam Cottage, my tires crunching over crushed shells that had lined the path. For decades, the sound had always been comforting before, a familiar welcome home. Now it felt like a warning, each crunch an alarm bell signaling that time was running out. The cottage looked the same as always, weathered blue clapboard siding, white gingerbread trim that Grandpa Theo had hand-carved, wrap-around porch with its collection of mismatched rocking chairs. But something felt different, foreign, like returning to find strangers had rearranged your furniture while you were gone. I noticed it immediately, a sleek black BMW parked in the side yard, partially hidden by the old boathouse, Dominic's car. My pulse quickened as I killed the engine and sat motionless, weighing my options. Confrontation now or stealth? I needed that key's secret more than I needed the satisfaction of catching them red-handed. Decision made, I reversed back down the driveway and parked on the public access road a quarter-mile away. The beach route would be longer, but would keep me hidden from view of the cottage's windows. I cut through the dunes, the tall seagrass whispering against my legs as I moved quickly but quietly toward the northern edge of the property. Grandpa. Theo's studio was a small outbuilding perched closer to the bluff than the main house, its large windows designed to capture the northern light artists preferred. I'd spent countless hours there as a child, watching him transform blank canvases into seascapes so vivid you could almost taste the salt spray. The studio door was locked. Unusual, as we typically left it open. Another bad sign. I knelt and retrieved the spare key from inside the conch shell, half buried beside the step, another of Grandpa's hiding places. The lock turned with a soft click, and I slipped inside, closing the door silently behind me. The studio smelled of linseed oil, turpentine, and the unique mineral scent of Grandpa's preferred blue pigment, a custom mix he'd perfected over decades. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light, streaming through the windows. Everything looked untouched, canvases stacked against walls, brushes standing in jars, his old leather chair still positioned before an unfinished painting of the lighthouse at dawn. I moved quickly to the north window, the one that framed a perfect view of the craggy rocks where seals liked to bask during low tide. The floorboard Grandpa had mentioned was easy to spot once I was looking for it, its edge slightly raised above its neighbors, the ancient nails less tarnished from decades of foot traffic. I wedged my fingers beneath it and pulled upward. The board lifted with a soft groan of old wood. Beneath it lay a metal strongbox, the kind used for fireproof document storage. My hands trembled slightly as I withdrew the brass key from my wallet and fitted it into the lock. The box contained several items: a thick manila envelope, a USB drive, and a sealed letter with my name written in Grandpa Theo's distinctive slanted handwriting. I reached for the letter first, breaking the seal with shaking fingers. "Ryan, if you're reading this, then someone has moved against Seafoam sooner than I anticipated. I've lived long enough to recognize greed when I see it, and I've seen how certain people look at this place, not for its beauty or history, but for its market value. I fear that once I'm gone, there will be pressure to sell. What you hold in your hands is insurance against that eventuality. The envelope contains the true deed to Seafoam Cottage. The deed filed with the county recorder is incomplete. I worked with my attorney, Margaret Chen, to create a special ownership structure that makes Seafoam impossible to sell without specific conditions being met. The legal term is a restrictive covenant with reversionary interest. In plain English, if anyone attempts to sell Seafoam within 15 years of my passing, ownership automatically reverts to the Theodore Harrington Conservation Trust, which has strict prohibitions against development. The USB drive contains video, footage of the actual signing of these documents, plus conversations that may prove valuable if certain parties dispute these arrangements. Margaret's contact information is inside the envelope. I'm sorry to burden you with this, my boy. I had hoped your marriage would improve with time, but I've seen how Elise looks at this place, and I've heard her speaking with that real estate friend of hers when they thought I was napping on the porch. They have plans, Ryan. Plans that have nothing to do with preserving what matters. Seafoam has been the heart of our family for 3 generations. The deed may have my name on it, but the soul of this place belongs to all of us, and to the future Harringtons who deserve to feel the same salt breeze we've cherished. Trust Margaret. She knows what to do. All my love, Grandpa Theo. I sat back on my heels, letter clutched in my hand as the implications sank in. My grandfather hadn't just suspected that someone might try to sell Seafoam. He'd known exactly who would attempt it, and he'd created a legal fortress to prevent it. The relief was so intense it made me dizzy. That relief was short-lived. Outside, car doors slammed, followed by the sound of voices approaching the main house. I recognized both instantly. Elise and Dominic. I had minutes, at most, before they might decide to check the studio. Working quickly, I photographed each document in the envelope with my phone, then slipped the USB drive into my pocket. I replaced everything else exactly as I'd found it, lowered the floorboard back into position, and moved to the window to assess my escape options. Elise and Dominic stood on the front porch of the main cottage. Even from this distance, their body language was unmistakable. His hand rested on the small of her back with the casual intimacy of long-established lovers. She leaned into him, laughing at something he said before they disappeared inside. The sight should have hurt more than it did. Perhaps I'd suspected longer than I'd admitted to myself, or perhaps the betrayal of Seafoam somehow eclipsed the betrayal of our marriage vows. Either way, I felt oddly detached, focused now on the practical problem of escape and next steps. I slipped out the studio's rear door, keeping low as I moved along the bluff path that would circle back to the public beach access. Once I reached my car, I didn't hesitate. I called Margaret Chen's number from the contact information in the envelope photos. Her assistant answered, and I used the code phrase Grandpa Theo had included in his letter. I'm calling about the Seafoam covenant. Within seconds, Margaret herself was on the line. Ryan Harrington, she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. I've been expecting your call, though I'll admit I thought it would come sooner. Where are you right now? Heading back from Cape Haven. I just found my grandfather's documents. Good. Don't go home. Come directly to my office in Portland. It's likely that your wife has been monitoring your movements, possibly your phone and email as well. A chill ran through me. You think this goes beyond just trying to sell the cottage? There was a brief pause. Theodore shared certain concerns with me before he passed. Concerns about financial improprieties involving your wife's marketing firm and a development company. I think it would be best to discuss this in person. Drive carefully but quickly. The clock is ticking. As I merged onto the coastal highway, my phone pinged with a text from Elise. Where are you? We need to talk about Seafoam. It's not what you think. No, I thought grimly. It's much worse than I thought. What had begun as a betrayal over a beloved family property was rapidly evolving into something far more complex. Whatever Grandpa Theo had discovered about Elise and Dominic Whatever was on that USB drive burning a hole in my pocket, it was significant enough that he'd created an elaborate legal safety net to protect not just Seafoam, but me as well. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of something beyond shock and anger. I felt purpose, clarity, and the absolute certainty that my grandfather, even from beyond the grave, had my back. 3 hours later, I walked into the gleaming offices of Chen and Associates in downtown Portland, prepared to discover exactly how deep this conspiracy went, and exactly how thoroughly my grandfather had outsmarted them all. Margaret Chen's corner office offered a panoramic view of Portland's skyline, but her attention was fixed entirely on the USB drive I'd placed on her glass desk. She was younger than I'd expected, early 50s perhaps, with sharp eyes behind stylish rectangular glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my grandfather. No wonder they'd gotten along. "Before we view the contents," she said, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, "I need you to understand something, Ryan. Theodore was more than a client to me. He was a friend who recognized a pattern of behavior that deeply concerned him." I nodded, trying to ignore the nervous energy coursing through me. "In his letter, he mentioned something about Elise and financial improprieties." Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral. "Your grandfather was an observant man. After his cancer diagnosis, when he spent more time at Seafoam, he began noticing inconsistencies. Phone calls Elise would take outside, documents she would hide when he entered. A room. He started paying attention." She unlocked a drawer in her desk and withdrew a thick file folder. "Theodore began keeping records. At first he thought he might be paranoid, a side effect of his medication perhaps. But the evidence mounted." She opened the folder, revealing pages of handwritten notes in my grandfather's distinctive script, along with printouts of emails and what appeared to be financial statements. "What exactly did he find?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Margaret slid the folder toward me. "Evidence suggesting your wife's marketing firm has been serving as a front for money laundering operations connected to coastal developments. They've been buying historic properties, demolishing them for luxury developments, and cycling the profits through shell companies. Your grandfather suspected Elise became involved approximately 3 years ago. 3 years. The time frame hit me like a physical blow. That was when Elise had suddenly pushed for separate bank accounts, citing the need for financial independence and business simplicity. I'd agreed, never questioning her motives. What a fool I'd been. "The cottage," I said slowly. "Is it really worth risking fraud charges over, even at $3.5 million?" Margaret gave me a knowing look. "It's not just about Seafoam's market value. According to Theodore's research, Coastal has been purchasing properties along that stretch of coastline systematically. Seafoam sits on the last parcel they need to complete a planned $50 million resort development. The number hung in the air between us. 50 million. No wonder they'd been willing to forge documents." "There's more," Margaret continued, turning her laptop toward me. "The restrictive covenant Theodore created is powerful legal protection, but he built in another safeguard as well. A silent partner in the Theodore Harrington Conservation Trust." She pulled up a document on her screen. "He named Cape Haven Historical Society as 49% stakeholder in the trust. If anyone attempts to challenge the covenant, they'll have to fight. Not just you, but a community organization with considerable local support and resources." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a faint smile tug at my lips. Classic Grandpa Theo, thinking 3 steps ahead and building alliances where they'd be most effective. "Now," Margaret said, picking up the USB drive, "let's see what Theodore wanted you to find." She inserted the drive into her laptop and clicked through several folders until she found a video file labeled Evidence 1. The screen flickered to life, showing Seafoam's back deck. The timestamp indicated it had been recorded 8 months ago. During one of the weekends, I'd been away at a conference. The image quality suggested a hidden camera, likely one of the security measures Grandpa had installed after a break-in the previous summer. Elise sat at the deck table with Dominic and another man I didn't recognize, older, expensively dressed, with the deep tan of someone who spent considerable time on a yacht. "That's Victor Chambers," Margaret murmured, CEO of Coastal Developments. On screen, Victor spread out what appeared to be architectural plans. "Once we acquire the Harrington property, we'll demolish everything and break ground immediately. The permitting has already been arranged." He tapped the plans. 30 luxury condos, a private marina, and a members-only beach club. Conservative ROI of 300% within 5 years. Dominic nodded enthusiastically, and with Theodore's health declining, the timing couldn't be better. Elise leaned forward, her expression calculating in a way I'd never seen before. "Ryan remains the obstacle. He's sentimental about this place. He won't agree to sell, not even after Theodore passes." Victor waved a dismissive hand. "That's where the power of attorney comes in. You're his wife. With the right documentation, you can move forward regardless of his objections." "And if he contests it?" Elise asked. Victor's smile was cold. "By then, the demolition will be complete. What's he going to do? Rebuild a century-old cottage from rubble? People get upset, they threaten lawsuits, but once the bulldozers have done their work, they typically settle for financial compensation. It's simply more practical. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that I could be bought off, that my grandfather's legacy could be reduced to a dollar figure, sent a surge of anger through me so intense my hands shook. "There's more," Margaret said quietly, clicking to another file. This one showed Elise in what appeared to be a hotel room, counting stacks of cash with Dominic. The amounts were substantial, easily tens of thousands of dollars. Down payment, Dominic explained on the recording. Victor prefers to keep certain transactions off the books. The rest comes when demolition begins. He laughed. "Consider it a divorce settlement in advance." I watched, numb, as my wife calmly bundled the cash into a briefcase. "What about Theodore's will?" Ryan mentioned something about restrictions on selling. "Already handled," Dominic replied. "The version filed with the county has no such restrictions." Old man must have been confused when he mentioned it to Ryan. Margaret stopped the video, her expression grim. "There are several more files like this." Theodore was thorough. I sat back, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't just fraud. It was conspiracy, money laundering, and a level of personal betrayal that seemed almost incomprehensible. "What's our next move?" I asked finally. Margaret closed her laptop with a decisive click. "First, we file for an emergency injunction to block any sale or demolition of Seafoam Cottage, citing the restrictive covenant. Then we contact the district attorney with these recordings." She checked her watch. "If we move quickly, we can have the paperwork filed before the courthouse closes today." "And Elise? Dominic?" "Once the DA sees this evidence, I expect arrest warrants will follow. Financial crimes involving these sums typically carry significant penalties." She fixed me with a direct look. "Are you prepared for that?" "She is still your wife." I thought about the woman in those videos. Cold, calculating, willing to destroy something precious to me for financial gain. That wasn't the woman I'd married. Or perhaps it was, and I simply hadn't been willing to see it. "Do what needs to be done," I said firmly. "Seafoam deserves better. So did my grandfather." Margaret nodded, already reaching for her phone. "I'll have my assistant prepare the injunction paperwork. Meanwhile, I suggest you check into a hotel rather than returning home. Use cash, not credit cards, and turn off your phone's location services. If they're monitoring you, that's almost certainly how." As she made calls and set the legal machinery, In motion, I gazed out at the Portland skyline, watching the afternoon sun glint off glass towers. In the span of a single day, my marriage had been revealed as a sham, my wife exposed as a criminal, and my beloved grandfather proven to be more prescient than I could have imagined. The irony wasn't lost on me. Seafoam Cottage, a place Elise had always complained was too old, too remote, too stuck in the past, had ultimately been her undoing. Because while she'd been plotting its destruction, she'd failed to notice the old-fashioned security cameras my grandfather had installed, or the fact that he'd spent his career as a judge before retiring to paint seascapes. Theodore Harrington had recognized the threat and quietly built a case. And then, knowing he wouldn't live to see justice served, he'd left the final move to me, along with all the resources I'd need to succeed. My phone buzzed with another text from Elise. "Ryan, this is urgent. Call me. There's been a misunderstanding." "About Seafoam." I showed the message to Margaret, who arched an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding about $50 million and forged documents. That's creative." For the first time that day, I actually laughed. Then I turned off my phone completely. The endgame had begun. And thanks to my grandfather's foresight, I wasn't just a step ahead. I was playing an entirely different game. The Ocean View Hotel overlooking Portland Harbor wasn't particularly luxurious, but it had two essential qualities. They accepted cash, and they didn't ask questions. I checked in under the name Theodore Chen, a small tribute to the two people who were helping me navigate this storm. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching darkness descend over the harbor. Fishing boats returned from their day at see their lights twinkling like stars fallen into the water. It was the kind of scene Grandpa Theo would have loved to paint. 10 hours earlier, my life had been normal, or what I'd thought was normal. Now I was essentially in hiding, my marriage revealed as a fraud and a legal battle looming. I felt strangely calm, perhaps because the path forward was so clear. No more ambiguity, no more making excuses for Elise's increasingly suspicious behavior. The truth had been laid bare in high-definition video. Margaret had texted from a secure messaging app she'd had me install. "Injunction filed and granted. Judge Wilson was an old colleague of Theodore's. Sheriff will serve notice to realtor and coastal tomorrow. DA reviewing evidence. Stay put," I replied with a simple thumbs up, then turned to my laptop. There was one more piece of this puzzle I needed to understand. Opening an incognito browser, I began researching Coastal Developments, LLC. What I found confirmed Margaret's assessment. Over the past 5 years, Coastal had systematically acquired 8 properties along the Cape Haven shoreline, all historic homes, all quickly demolished for luxury development. Environmental protests, historical society objections, even local government concerns had all been mysteriously dropped or overruled. An article from the local paper showed Victor Chambers cutting a ribbon at a development called The Tides, too. Years ago, standing alongside the mayor and, I leaned closer to the screen, Andrea Harrington, my mother-in-law, I sat back, the connection crystallizing. Andrea had been on Cape Haven's town council for nearly a decade. She'd also been strangely enthusiastic about my marriage to Elise, despite the obvious differences in our backgrounds and interests. Had this been the plan all along? A marriage that would eventually give them access to Seafoam Cottage? It seemed paranoid, and yet Andrea had been the one to introduce Elise to me at a charity gala she'd organized. The same gala that Victor Chambers had sponsored. I dug deeper, searching for connections between Elise's marketing firm, Coastal Developments, and local government contracts. The trail was deliberately obscured, but pattern emerged. Elise's firm, Lighthouse Marketing, had received consulting contracts from every municipality where Coastal had developments. The amounts were substantial, often hundreds of thousands of dollars for community outreach and public relations services, money flowing from developers to local governments to Elise's firm. Classic kickback structure. Clean enough to survive. Casual scrutiny, but clear enough when you knew what to look for. I was compiling these connections into a document for Margaret when my laptop pinged with an email notification. Despite using incognito mode, I'd forgotten to log out of my personal email. The message was from an unfamiliar address, tharrington.legacysecuremail.com. The subject line, "In case of emergency." My breath caught. Another posthumous message from Grandpa Theo? I clicked it open. "Ryan, if you're reading this, it means Margaret has determined the situation with Seafoam has escalated to critical. This automated message was scheduled to be sent to you if certain legal filings were made. There's one more resource you should know about. In the boathouse at Seafoam, beneath the old wooden dinghy, there's a waterproof safe built into the concrete floor. The combination is your birthday, month, day, year, no spaces. Inside, you'll find documentation I've compiled over 3 years, tracking the connection between coastal developments, your mother-in-law's activities on the town council, and the systematic dismantling of Cape Haven's historical protections. More importantly, you'll find the original survey maps of the Seafoam property. What few people remember, and what I deliberately obscured when I purchased the additional acreage 30 years ago, is that Seafoam's property line extends 200 yards further north than shown in current county records. That additional land includes the freshwater spring that supplies not only our cottage, but the entire proposed development area. Without access to that spring, their $50 million resort becomes unviable. The correct survey documents are included, along with verification from the original surveyor, who is still alive and willing to testify if needed. Seafoam isn't just the last piece of their puzzle. It's the piece that renders their entire project impossible if protected correctly. This is your trump card, Ryan. Use it only if absolutely necessary. Sometimes the most powerful move is the one you hold in reserve. I'm sorry to have drawn you into this fight, but I know you're equal to it. Seafoam chose you as much as you chose it. Grandpa Theo, I read the email twice more, each time marveling at my grandfather's foresight. He hadn't just been protecting his property, he'd been gathering ammunition for a battle he knew would come. The question now was whether I should tell Margaret about this new information immediately or follow my grandfather's advice to hold it in reserve. Before I could decide, my burner phone rang. "Margaret." "Ryan," she said without preamble, her voice tight with urgency. "There's been a development. Satellite imagery shows vehicles at Seafoam, construction equipment. They're moving despite the injunction." "That's illegal," I said, already grabbing my jacket. "The sheriff hasn't even served them yet." "Exactly. They're trying to create a fait accompli, destroy the property before legal proceedings can stop them. Victor Chambers has used this tactic before. Once the historical structure is demolished, courts tend to allow development to proceed since the damage is already done." Cold fury washed over me. "I'm going there." "Ryan, no. It's too dangerous. Let me contact the sheriff." "By the time the sheriff mobilizes, Seafoam could be rubble," I cut in. "Besides, there's something in the boathouse I need to retrieve, something my grandfather left that could change everything." There was a brief silence on the line. "What kind of something?" "Insurance," I said. "The ultimate blocking move. But I need to get to it before they demolish the boathouse." She sighed. "I can't stop you, but at least don't go alone. I'm calling Adam Torres, my investigator. He's ex-police, licensed to carry. He can meet you there in 30 minutes. Tell him to look for a blue Honda Civic," I said, already heading for the door. "It's not my car. I rented it cash from a local place, just in case they're watching for my vehicle." "Be careful, Ryan. These people have millions at stake. They won't just walk away." As I drove through the night toward Cape Haven, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then building to a steady drumbeat on the roof of the car. Appropriate weather for what felt increasingly like a final confrontation. I tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered in just one day. My wife's betrayal, a years-long conspiracy involving her family, millions in kickbacks, and my grandfather's methodical counter-strategy that he'd developed, even as cancer was claiming his life. The weight of his trust settled on my shoulders. He could have sold Seafoam himself in his final years, lived out his days in luxury. Instead, he'd fought a silent battle to preserve it, knowing he wouldn't live to see the outcome, trusting me to carry it through. I wouldn't let him down. As I approached Cape Haven, I dimmed my lights and took the back road that circled around to the public beach access. Through the curtain of rain, I could see lights at Seafoam. Too many lights. Industrial floodlights mounted on vehicles, illuminating the cottage and grounds in harsh white brightness that stripped away all its charm and warmth. I parked behind the dunes, pulling on a dark raincoat as I spotted another car approaching, slowly with its lights off. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with the alert posture of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Adam Torres," he said quietly, extending his hand. "Margaret sent me." "Thank you for coming," I replied, quickly explaining about the safe in the boathouse and what it contained. Adam nodded, water streaming down his face. "Here's how we play this. They're probably focused on the main house. We approach along the shoreline, use the rocks as cover, and make for the boathouse from the waterside. If we're spotted, I'll create a distraction while you get what you need." The plan was simple but solid. We moved along the wet sand, the sound of our footsteps lost in the crash of waves and drumming rain. As we drew closer, I could see figures moving around the cottage, workmen in rain gear, unloading equipment from trucks, and there, standing under the shelter of the porch, the unmistakable figures of Elise, Dominic, and Victor Chambers. They were really going to do it. They were going to destroy Seafoam tonight, injunction be damned, and trust that their money and connections would shield them from consequences. The realization sent a surge of resolve through me. The boathouse stood about 50 yards from the main cottage, closer to the water, its weathered boards silver-grey in the distant floodlights. As we approached from the blind side, I felt a surge of relief to see it was still untouched, no equipment positioned nearby. "Stay low," Adam whispered. "I'll keep watch while you get the safe open." I slipped inside, the familiar smells of old wood, salt and marine varnish enveloping me. How many summer days had I spent here with Grandpa Theo, readying the small sailboat, untangling fishing lines, listening to his stories of the sea. The thought that this place might be reduced to splinters by morning filled me with a cold, focused anger. The wooden dinghy hung from the ceiling on ancient pulleys. I released the catch, lowering it carefully to the floor, then moved it aside to reveal the concrete beneath. Just as Grandpa had described, there was a small safe built into the floor, its existence disguised by a covering of the same concrete aggregate as the surrounding area. I entered the combination, my birthday, and heard the satisfying click of the lock releasing. Inside, waterproof document cases were stacked neatly, each labeled in my grandfather's precise handwriting. The top one read simply, "The Spring. Original Survey, 1926. I just lifted it out when Adam appeared at the doorway. His expression, urgent. "They're coming. 2 men heading this way with sledgehammers. We need to move, now." I grabbed the document case and another labeled Coastal Developments, Financial Transactions, then sealed the safe and slid the dinghy back over it. There was no time to replace it on its pulleys. "Back door," I whispered, leading Adam to the small exit that opened directly onto the rocky shoreline. We slipped out just as flashlight beams cut through the front entrance of the boathouse. "Let's split up," Adam said quickly. "Meet at the car. Go!" I darted along the shoreline, keeping low among the rocks, the document cases clutched tightly against my chest. Behind me, I heard voices raised in confusion, then alarm. They'd discovered the dinghy moved, the signs of our presence. The flashlight beams began to sweep the shoreline. I pressed myself against a large boulder, heart pounding, as one of the beams passed within inches of my position. From somewhere to my right came a sudden crash and shout. Adam, deliberately, creating a distraction. It worked. The flashlights and voices moved away, pursuing the sound. I seized my chance, sprinting through the rain toward the dune path that would lead me back to the car. As I crested the dune, I glanced back one last time at Seafoam Cottage, its white trim gleaming in the cruel industrial lights, equipment poised to begin its destruction. I felt a fierce, almost primal determination take hold. They thought tonight would be the end of Seafoam. Instead, it would be the beginning of their downfall. Because now I had what I needed, the final piece of my grandfather's master strategy, the proof that would not just save Seafoam, but destroy their entire development scheme. I reached the car, threw the document cases onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. Adam was still out there, but I had faith in his abilities. Margaret wouldn't have sent him if he couldn't handle himself. Sure enough, as I watched the rearview mirror, a figure emerged from the darkness and slipped into the second car. We pulled away separately, no headlights, just two shadows disappearing into the rainy night. In my pocket, the burner phone vibrated with a text from Adam. Got out clean, following you, don't stop until Portland. In the seat beside me, my grandfather's documents promised the leverage I would need. By moving against Seafoam tonight, Victor, Dominic and Elise had just made their fatal mistake. They had violated a direct court order, committed trespassing, attempted destruction of property under injunction, and provided witnesses to testify to all of it. As Cape Haven receded, behind me, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. The path forward was clear now, the battle joined in earnest. And thanks to Grandpa Theo's meticulous planning, I wasn't just fighting back, I was about to go on the offensive. By dawn, Margaret Chen's conference room had been transformed into a war room. Documents from my grandfather's safe covered the large oak table, surveys, financial records, photographs, and meticulously annotated town council minutes spanning 3 years. 3 laptops sat open, displaying different aspects of the evidence we were compiling. The air smelled of strong coffee and determination. This is extraordinary, said James Sullivan, the district attorney Margaret had called in at first light. He lifted the original survey map, examining the clear discrepancy between the official property line and what my grandfather had documented. And you're certain this surveyor, William Porter, is still alive and willing to testify? Margaret nodded. I spoke with him an hour ago. He's 86, sharp as a tack, and furious that his original work was altered in county records. Apparently he's had suspicions for years, but couldn't prove anything without the original documents, which Theodore had secured. Sullivan set down the survey and picked up a folder of financial documents. And these transfers from coastal to various LLCs, then to the town of Cape Haven for infrastructure improvements, then to Lighthouse Marketing for public relations. You're suggesting this is a kickback scheme? Not suggesting, I said firmly, proving. The amounts aligned perfectly with property acquisitions along the coastline. Each time Coastal bought and demolished a historic property, this exact financial pattern followed. Adam Torres, who had arrived safely shortly after I did, pointed to another document. And here's the smoking gun. Emails between Andrea Harrington and Victor Chambers discussing how to handle the zoning board's concerns. She explicitly mentions using her daughter's connection to Ryan to eventually secure Seafoam Cottage. The words still had the power to cut deep. My marriage, 15 years of what I'd thought was partnership, had been at least partly engineered as a long con to secure valuable property. Had Elise ever genuinely cared for me? There had been moments, vacations in Maine, quiet evenings by the fire, her support when my father died. That had felt real, or had I simply seen what I wanted to see? Sullivan leaned back, rubbing his temples. The financial fraud is clear. The conspiracy to commit fraud, involving the forged power of attorney, is clear. The violation of the injunction last night adds criminal contempt. He fixed me with a serious look. But there's something I need to address, Mr. Harrington. Your grandfather's actions, while ultimately protective, skirted some legal boundaries. He deliberately obscured property records, installed hidden cameras without disclosure. 2. Document criminal conspiracy, Margaret interjected smoothly. As a former judge, Theodore understood exactly where the line was, and he never crossed it. The property boundary issue was simply his choice not to correct a clerical error that worked in his favor. As for the cameras, they were on his private property, recording conversations for which there was no reasonable expectation of privacy. Sullivan nodded slowly. Fair enough. Still, defense attorneys will try to paint him as manipulative. I straightened in my chair. My grandfather watched as historic homes were systematically destroyed around him. He saw local officials corrupted, environmental protections ignored, and realized his own property was targeted next. When traditional channels failed, he created his own justice system. I'm proud of what he did. A small smile crossed Sullivan's face. So noted. He gathered the documents into organized piles. I have more than enough here to issue warrants for Victor Chambers, Dominic Walsh, Elise Harrington, and Andrea Harrington on multiple charges. The attempted demolition last night, despite a court order, gives us grounds to move immediately. Margaret's assistant knocked and entered. Sorry to interrupt, but there's something you all need to see. She picked up a remote and turned on the conference room's wall-mounted television, tuning it to a local news channel. On screen, Victor Chambers stood in front of Seafoam Cottage, looking polished despite the early hour. Construction equipment loomed behind him, but the cottage itself stood intact in the morning light. Simply a misunderstanding, he was saying smoothly to a reporter. We had not yet been formally served with the injunction when our crews arrived. To begin preliminary work, once we were notified, we immediately halted all activities, as is evident. He gestured to the untouched cottage. Coastal Developments has always operated with complete transparency and respect for local ordinances. That's a bald-faced lie, Adam muttered. They were actively preparing for demolition. The reporter continued, Mr. Chambers, how do you respond to rumors that there's a dispute over ownership of the property? Victor's smile never wavered. There is no dispute. We have a signed agreement with Elise Harrington, who has legal authority to sell the property. Her husband's reluctance is understandable. Historic properties often carry emotional attachments, but sometimes progress requires difficult choices. The camera panned to show Elise standing nearby, looking appropriately somber in a tasteful blue dress. This has been an emotional time for our family, she said, her voice catching slightly. Ryan's grandfather meant the world to him, to all of us. But Theodore also understood that hanging on to the past sometimes prevents us from building a better future. The resort will provide jobs and economic opportunities for Cape Haven while preserving public beach access and honoring the area's heritage. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. The sheer audacity to stand in front of my grandfather's home, invoking his name while plotting to destroy his legacy, sent a wave of anger through me so intense I could barely speak. Sullivan switched off the TV. They're getting ahead of the story. Classic damage control. They're also giving us rope to hang them with, Margaret said calmly. Every word of that press conference contradicts the evidence we have. The signed agreement she mentioned, that's the forged document. The claim they stopped work when notified of the injunction. We have Adam's testimony and time-stamped photos proving otherwise. She turned to me. Ryan, this is actually good news. They're committing to their false narrative publicly, which makes our evidence all the more damning. Sullivan nodded. I agree. In fact, his phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked up with grim satisfaction. Warrants approved. I have officers. Preparing to execute them now. Wait, I said, an idea forming. What if we let them dig themselves in deeper first? All eyes turned to me. I continued. They're at Seafoam right now, presenting themselves as the reasonable parties, us as the emotional obstructionists. What if we change that narrative before the arrests? Margaret tilted her head. What do you have in mind? A counter-press conference, right there at Seafoam. We bring William Porter, the original surveyor with the true property maps. We bring the Cape Haven Historical Society to announce their legal interest in the property through my grandfather's trust. And we bring the environmental impact statements showing how the development would damage the coastline. Sullivan considered this. It's unorthodox, but it's brilliant, Margaret finished. It forces them to respond in real time, without their prepared statements and PR spin. And when the arrests happen immediately afterward, the public narrative is completely reframed. Sullivan checked his watch. I can delay the arrests by 2 hours. Will that give you enough time? Margaret was already on her phone. William Porter lives 20 minutes away. The head of the Historical Society is my brother's neighbor. We can assemble the key players within an hour. Adam stood. I'll drive Ryan. Given the circumstances, he shouldn't be alone. As they mobilized around me, I felt a strange sense of calm. In just 24 hours, my life had been upended. My marriage revealed as a fraud, a criminal conspiracy exposed. Yet somehow I felt more clear-headed than I had in years. The fog of doubt and confusion that had slowly enveloped my relationship. With Elise, the unexplained absences, the financial secretiveness, the gradual emotional distance was lifted. The truth, however painful, was clarifying. Margaret pulled me aside as the others prepared to leave. Ryan, are you absolutely certain about this approach? Once you step in front of those cameras, there's no going back. Your marriage, your private life, everything becomes public record. I thought about it for a long moment. My grandfather didn't hide from this fight, even when he knew he wouldn't live to see its resolution. He trusted me to finish what he started. I met her eyes steadily. Besides, a marriage built on lies was never really a marriage at all. She squeezed my arm. Theodore would be proud, not just of what you're doing, but how you're doing it. An hour later, Adam and I were driving back to Cape Haven, this time in Margaret's SUV, with William Porter, the elderly surveyor, in the back seat alongside Harriet Lowell, the formidable president of the Cape Haven Historical Society. Porter clutched the original survey maps in a leather portfolio, occasionally muttering about those damned crooks, and how he'd known something was fishy for years. Harriet was simultaneously working her phone and briefing me on the historical significance of Seafoam Cottage, the sea captain who built it in 1887, the writer who had lived there in the 1930s and written a Pulitzer-winning novel about the coast, and of course my grandfather's own contributions to local arts and culture through his seascapes, many of which hung in the town hall. Your grandfather was a treasure, she said firmly. When he approached me about making the Historical Society a stakeholder in his trust, I knew exactly what he was doing, creating a fortress they couldn't breach with money alone. Porter nodded vigorously. Theodore Harrington was sharp as they come. When he asked me to keep a copy of the original survey locked in my office, I didn't ask questions, just knew it was important. As we approached Cape Haven, Sullivan called with an update. News crews are still there. Chambers is giving what amounts to a PR tour of the property, talking about their plans for the Seafoam Resort and Marina. Your wife is with him, playing the reluctant but practical spouse role to perfection. We're 10 minutes out, I replied. Are your people in position? Unmarked cars at both access roads. They'll move on my signal after your press conference. I ended the call, a strange mixture of emotions churning inside me. Part of me dreaded confronting Elise publicly, seeing the face I'd woken up beside for 15 years transform when she realized the game was up. Another part, the part that had been lied to, manipulated and betrayed, anticipated it with something close to satisfaction. As we crested the final hill approaching Seafoam, I could see the media setup. 3 local news vans, reporters with microphones, Victor Chambers gesturing expansively toward the ocean view. Elise stood slightly apart, checking her phone with a worried expression. Even from this distance, I could see she looked tense. Adam parked on the public access road, out of sight of the main property. "Ready?" he asked quietly. I looked at Seafoam Cottage, standing resolute against the morning sky, its weathered blue boards and white trim, a testament to endurance. My grandfather's voice seemed to echo in my mind. "Some things are worth fighting for, Ryan. Not because they're valuable, but because they're valuable to us." "Ready," I answered, and stepped out to reclaim what was mine. The media didn't notice us at first. They were captivated by Victor Chambers, who was standing at the edge of the bluff, pointing toward the ocean with theatrical flourish as he described the world-class marina that would soon replace the dilapidated boathouse. Several reporters nodded appreciatively, jotting notes or capturing footage on shoulder-mounted cameras. Elise spotted us first. I saw the exact moment recognition dawned. Her posture stiffened, her hand froze mid-text, and her carefully composed expression faltered. She quickly nudged Dominic, who was standing nearby reviewing documents with a man in a hard hat. He looked up, saw me approaching with my unlikely entourage, and immediately reached for his phone. By the time we reached the gathering, Victor Chambers had been alerted as well. His polished smile dimmed only slightly as he turned to face us. Well, he said, his voice carrying for the benefit of the reporters. "Ryan Harrington, I was hoping we might have a chance to speak today." "I'm sure you were," I replied evenly. I gestured to my companions. "I've brought some people who might interest the press. This is William Porter, the original surveyor who mapped the Seafoam property in 1972, and this is Harriet Lowell, president of the Cape Haven Historical Society and legal stakeholder in the Theodore Harrington Conservation Trust." The reporters, sensing a more interesting story than a standard development announcement, immediately shifted their attention. Cameras turned toward us, microphones extended. "Mr. Porter," called out a reporter from the local NBC affiliate, "what brings you here today?" William Porter, surprisingly spry for his 86 years, stepped forward with his leather portfolio. "Correcting. A fraud," he announced without preamble. "The property maps being used by coastal developments are falsified. I should know. I drew the originals." A ripple of interest moved through the assembled media. Another reporter stepped forward. "Ms. Lowell, you mentioned a conservation trust. How does that relate to the sale of this property?" Harriet, every inch the retired high school principal she'd once been, straightened to her full height. "Theodore Harrington established a conservation trust with the Historical Society as 49% stakeholder. Any sale of this property triggers an automatic reversion clause that transfers ownership to the trust. This was his explicit wish, to prevent exactly this type of development." Victor's smile had vanished completely now. He moved toward us, Dominic and Elise flanking him like lieutenants. "These are serious allegations," he said, his voice tight, despite the pleasant expression he attempted to maintain. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately rather than creating a spectacle." "Why?" I asked, loud enough for the cameras to capture. "You seemed quite comfortable discussing the future of my property publicly. Let's continue that transparency." Dominic stepped forward, attempting damage control. There seems to be some confusion. We have legal documentation showing Mrs. Harrington has authority to sell the property. You mean this documentation? I held up copies of the forged power of attorney, the one with the signature that doesn't match any legal document I've ever signed. The one created while I was out of the country, according to travel records. That documentation. The reporters were furiously taking notes now, cameras focused on the confrontation. Elise remained silent, her face a mask of calculated concern, though I could see the panic building behind her eyes. "Mr. Chambers," called out a reporter from the Cape Haven Chronicle, "is it true that Coastal Developments attempted demolition last night despite a court injunction?" Victor's practiced poise wavered. As I stated earlier, there was a misunderstanding about the timing of the injunction. No actual demolition took place. "That's not what these show," Adam said, stepping forward with his phone displaying time-stamped photos from the previous night. "These were taken at 11:42 p.m., showing your crew's positioning equipment after the injunction was issued at 5:17 p.m. You were personally on site directing the operation." Another reporter pushed forward. "Mr. Porter, you mentioned falsified property. Maps. Can you elaborate?" Porter unfolded his survey maps on the hood of a nearby vehicle. "The current county records show Seafoam's northern boundary ending here," he indicated with a gnarled finger. "But the original survey, which I personally conducted when Judge Harrington purchased the adjacent parcel in 1972, shows the true boundary extends 200 yards further, encompassing this entire area, including the freshwater spring that serves as the water source for the entire bluff." The reporter looked confused. "Why would that matter for a development?" I stepped in. "Because without access to that spring, their entire resort project is unviable. Cape Haven's municipal water system doesn't extend to this area, and the cost of creating new infrastructure would make the project financially untenable. They need my property not just for the location, but for the water rights." Victor Chambers was no longer pretending to be calm. "These accusations are completely unfounded. We have conducted thorough due diligence, including bribing town officials." Harriet interjected sharply. She held up a folder. "We have documentation showing systematic payments from Coastal Developments to town infrastructure funds, which were then directed to Lighthouse Marketing, Mrs. Harrington's company, for non-existent services. Over $3 million in the past 5 years, coinciding exactly with property acquisitions along this coastline." The reporters erupted with questions. In the chaos, Elise finally approached me, her voice low and urgent. "Ryan, stop this. You have no idea what you're doing." I met her gaze steadily. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm protecting my grandfather's legacy from people who see nothing but dollar signs. That includes you, Elise." "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she hissed. "Nobody was going to get hurt. It was just business." "Just business," I repeated. "Forging my signature was just business? Lying about where you were, who you were with for years, that was just business too?" Something flashed in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or simply calculation. "We can still fix this. Call off whatever you're planning, and I'll make sure you're compensated fairly. Think about it, Ryan. Millions of dollars, a fresh start." The offer was so breathtakingly callous that I almost laughed. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about money." A commotion at the edge of the gathering drew our attention. Several unmarked police cars had pulled up, and officers in plain clothes were approaching, led by Sullivan himself. The district attorney nodded slightly in my direction before turning to Victor. "Victor Chambers," he announced formally. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted property destruction in violation of a court order, money laundering, and bribery of public officials." The shock that rippled through the assembled media was palpable. Cameras swung to capture Victor's expression as an officer began reading him his rights. Dominic attempted to back away, but was quickly intercepted by another officer. "Dominic Walsh, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of legal documents, and violation of a court injunction." Finally, Sullivan turned to Elise. His expression was professionally neutral, but I caught a flash of genuine sympathy in his eyes, not for her, but for me, witnessing this public unraveling of my marriage. "Elise Harrington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, money laundering, and violation of a court injunction." As an officer approached with handcuffs, Elise's composure finally cracked. "Ryan," she said, her voice breaking, "don't let them do this. Whatever your grandfather told you was the truth," I finished quietly, "which is more than you ever gave me." The officers led the three away, past the stunned reporters who had just witnessed a real estate announcement transform into a multiple arrest operation. In the distance, I could see additional police vehicles at Andrea Harrington's home. The net had closed on the entire operation. William Porter placed a weathered hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud, son. He fought them the only way he could, by planning ahead. You finished what he started." One reporter, more persistent than the others, approached me cautiously. "Mr. Harrington, how does it feel to discover your wife was involved in a conspiracy against your property?" I looked towards Seafoam Cottage, still standing despite all attempts to destroy it. The morning sun glinted off its windows, and for a moment I could almost see my grandfather on the porch, paintbrush in hand, blue eyes crinkling with his characteristic wry smile. "It feels like waking up," I said finally. "Sometimes you don't realize how much you've been living in someone else's story until you reclaim your own." "And Seafoam Cottage, what happens to it now?" I smiled for what felt like the first time in days. "Exactly what my grandfather intended. It stays in the family. It stays standing." I paused, an idea forming. "And perhaps someday, part of it becomes a public gallery for his artwork, so everyone can experience what he saw in this coastline, something worth protecting, not exploiting." As the reporters dispersed to file their stories, a much bigger scoop than they'd anticipated this morning, Adam, Harriet, William and I stood together on the bluff overlooking the ocean. The same view that had inspired my grandfather's paintings, that had drawn generations of Harringtons to this spot. "What now?" Adam asked quietly. I took a deep breath of salt air. "Now I go home. My real home." I walked towards Seafoam Cottage, each step feeling like a return to something authentic after years of subtle deception. The key still worked in the lock. Some things, at least, remained unchanged. Inside, afternoon light streamed through the windows, illuminating the living room with its stone fireplace and walls lined with my grandfather's seascapes. I moved through the familiar spaces, cataloguing what remained and what had been packed away during Elise's preparations. Most of his paintings were still here, too personally valuable to me, too commercially worthless to others. They had been deemed not worth taking. In his studio, the unfinished lighthouse painting still stood on the easel, waiting for a hand that would never return to complete it. On the small desk nearby lay his journal, open to his last entry, April 18th. "Seafoam has protected this family for generations. Now it's time for the family to protect Seafoam. Ryan will understand when the time comes. Of all of us, he sees this place most clearly for what it is, not an asset, but a heart." I closed the journal gently, understanding at last the depth of the trust he had placed in me. This wasn't just about property or money or even family legacy. It was about recognizing that some places have a soul of their own, formed by the lives and loves they've witnessed, the stories they've sheltered. Outside, the waves continued their eternal conversation with the shore, a dialogue that had been ongoing long before any of us arrived and would continue long after we were gone. There was comfort in that permanence, that indifference to human schemes and ambitions. From the porch, I could see police vehicles still parked at various points along the road, officers cataloguing evidence and taking statements. The machinery of justice, set in motion by my grandfather's foresight and my own determination, would now proceed at its own measured pace. Whatever happened next, the trials, the inevitable legal battles, the dissolution of my marriage, Seafoam, would remain. Changed, perhaps, as all things are changed by the storms they weather, but standing. Like me. 3 days after the arrests, I sat in the county detention center's visitor room, waiting. Despite Margaret's advice against it, I needed answers only Elise could provide. The door buzzed. Elise entered in an orange jumpsuit, her normally perfect appearance subdued, hair in a simple ponytail. We studied each other across the metal table, strangers who had shared 15 years of marriage. "You look terrible," she finally said, her voice softer than expected. "So do you," I replied. Orange never was my color. A ghost of her familiar smile appeared. I leaned forward. "Why, Elise? Was any of it real?" She looked down at her hands. "Which part?" "Any part. Our marriage. Us. It wasn't supposed to go this way," she sighed. "When my mother introduced us, yes, there was an agenda. The Harrington property was already on Victor's radar. But then," she met my eyes, "I liked you, Ryan. You were kind, stable, honest, everything the men in my family weren't. So it started as a con, but you developed feelings. The first few years were good, weren't they?" she asked. I thought back to weekend trips, shared dreams, plans made in the darkness of night. "Yes," I admitted. I wasn't pretending then, but the pressure from Victor and my mother never stopped. There were financial complications you didn't know about. My father's debts, leverage they had over me. "You could have told me. We could have faced it together," she shook her head. "Victor isn't just a business associate. He's my mother's cousin. Family business is handled within the family." "And Dominic?" A flush crossed her cheeks. "That was a mistake. Victor brought him into the project because of our history, knowing I'd cooperate if Dominic was involved. Were you in love with him?" "No. He was convenient, familiar. And now you're facing serious criminal charges. Was it worth it?" "My attorney thinks we can make a deal. I have information about bigger operations along the East Coast." "Always an angle," I said, unable to hide my disdain. "What did you expect? I'm fighting for my life here, while I'm picking up the pieces of mine." I leaned forward. "Why rush the demolition? Why not just wait for the legal process?" Something flickered across her face. Fear, perhaps. "That wasn't my decision. Victor insisted once he learned about the surveyor. He said we needed to create irrevocable change before the truth about the water rights came out." She glanced toward the guard, then lowered her voice. "Ryan, there's something you should know. The Seafoam project wasn't just about luxury development. Preliminary surveys revealed significant deposits of rare earth minerals beneath the coastline, worth potentially hundreds of millions. Victor's end investors are mining interests, using the resort as cover for extraction operations. "Do you have proof?" She nodded. "In my private email. The account information is in the lining of my jewelry box, third drawer of my vanity. Password is your birthday plus the year we met." "Time's up," the officer announced. Elise stood. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for getting caught, but for what I did to us. There was a time when we were good together. Real." "One last question. The night you accepted Victor's proposal, did you hesitate at all?" "Yes. I thought about our 4th anniversary at Seafoam during that winter storm. The power went out, and we sat in front of the fireplace drinking wine, listening to your grandfather's stories. You were so happy." She swallowed. I hesitated. "Ryan, but not for long enough." Outside, I called Margaret immediately. "We need to search Elise's things. There may be evidence of something much bigger than real estate fraud. Mining interests, rare earth minerals under the coastline." "I'll call Sullivan," Margaret replied. "This changes everything." Driving back to Seafoam, I realized that my grandfather's efforts to protect his property had inadvertently blocked an environmental disaster. His conservationist instincts had proven more prescient than even he might have realized. As the sun set behind the cottage, casting long shadows across the weathered blue boards, I understood that this battle was far from over. What had begun as a betrayal over property had revealed itself as something much darker, and the fight to protect Seafoam had only just begun. Armed with Elise's login information, I sat at her vanity while Adam kept watch. The laptop hummed to life, connecting to an email account I'd never known existed. Inside the folder labeled Seafoam Initiative were hundreds of messages spanning 3 years. I clicked on one from Victor Chambers dated shortly after my grandfather's. Diagnosis. Phase 1 geological survey confirms previous estimates. Concentration of lanthanides exceeds projections. Potential value, 200 DOS, 250 mils. Proceed with acquisition strategy through connection. Remember, this is about the resort, nothing else. Adam whistled low. Lanthanides, rare earth elements essential for technology manufacturing. If there's a significant deposit under that coastline, then the resort was never the real objective, I finished. Just the cover story. I opened an attachment labeled Extraction Timeline. It showed detailed plans for a mining operation, disguised as resort construction, beginning with foundation work that would actually be preliminary extraction. The environmental impact would be catastrophic, Adam said, pointing to projected excavation depths. They'd destroy the entire coastal ecosystem. Another email from someone at Terra Nova Resources outlined the extraction process. Water access is critical. Spring on Harrington property provides ideal solution for processing needs. Without it, extraction costs increase by 60%, potentially making operation unviable. The spring, the same one my grandfather had protected through the property line. Discrepancy. He'd known there was something valuable there, though perhaps not exactly what. I clicked on a video file. It showed Victor, Dominic, and 2 men I didn't recognize standing on Seafoam's bluff. Victor gestured toward the cottage. Once demolition is complete, we move immediately to Phase 1 extraction. The resort construction provides perfect cover. Environmental reviews have been managed. One of the unknown men spoke with a slight accent, and the water rights issue. Being handled through family connection, Victor replied, nodding toward my house in the distance. Husband remains obstacle, but wife has agreed to necessary steps. The timestamp showed this was filmed just 3 months ago, while I was on a business trip on my property, planning its destruction with my wife's complicity. Adam touched my shoulder. There's your smoking gun. I downloaded everything to a flash drive, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about preventing environmental destruction on a massive scale. We need to get this to Sullivan immediately, I said. As we prepared to leave, my phone rang. Margaret. Ryan, where are you right now? Her voice was tight with urgency. At my house? Why? Get out of there now. Victor Chambers made bail 20 minutes ago. His first call was to a number we've identified as belonging to Terra Nova Resources security personnel. We're leaving, I said, already moving toward the door. We found proof of the mining operation in Elise's emails. It's worse than we thought. Meet me at my office. Sullivan's already on his way. As we hurried down the stairs, headlights swept across the front windows. A black SUV pulled into the driveway, followed by another. Back door, Adam whispered, drawing a compact pistol from his jacket. We slipped through the kitchen as the front doorbell rang, followed immediately by a heavy pounding. Harrington, open up! We know you're in there! A man's voice, unfamiliar, authoritative. We exited through the garage, ducking behind landscaping as armed men in dark clothing surrounded the house. Not police, private security, likely Terra Novas. Split up Adam whispered. "Take the flash drive to Margaret. I'll create a diversion." Before I could argue, he darted across the lawn toward the street, intentionally visible. Shouts erupted, and two men gave chase, allowing me to slip away in the opposite direction. I cut through neighboring yards, heart pounding, the flash drive clutched in my palm. The scale of what we'd uncovered was staggering. This wasn't just about a beach house or a failed marriage anymore. It was about powerful interests willing to do anything, including sending armed men after me to protect hundreds of millions in mining profits. My grandfather had sensed the danger, built his legal fortifications, and ensured the truth would eventually emerge. But he couldn't have anticipated how far they would go. As police sirens wailed in the distance, Adam must have called them, I realized a fundamental truth. Seafoam Cottage wasn't just worth fighting for because of sentimental value or family history. It was literally standing between environmental destruction and one of the most beautiful coastlines in the country. The pieces all fit now. Why they needed my property specifically, why they'd resorted to fraud, why demolition had been so urgent. They'd been operating on borrowed time, afraid the truth about what lay beneath the surface would be discovered. And now I held that truth in my hand, racing through the darkness toward people who could help me bring it to light. Behind me, shouts, and the thunder of pursuing footsteps told me the fight was far from over. Margaret's office had transformed into a command center. Two police officers stood guard outside, while inside, Sullivan, Margaret, and now a representative from the Environmental Protection Agency huddled around a conference table reviewing the contents of the flash drive. "This goes far beyond local jurisdiction," said Karen Reeves, the EPA agent, her expression grim as she reviewed the extraction plans. The proposed mining operation would violate at least 6 federal environmental protection statutes. The damage to the coastline would be irreversible. Sullivan nodded, scrolling through emails on his laptop. "And the attempt to conceal it behind a resort development constitutes conspiracy to circumvent environmental impact reviews." He looked at me. "Mr. Harrington, your grandfather appears to have inadvertently stumbled onto something much bigger than a real estate dispute." "Not inadvertently," I corrected. "He suspected something was wrong with the development patterns along the coast. He just might not have known exactly what." My phone buzzed with a text from Adam. "Safe with police. Terra Nova personnel being detained." Relief washed over me. After our escape from my house, I hadn't been sure if Adam had evaded the security team pursuing us. "Terra Nova Resources," Margaret mused, pulling up information on her computer. "Registered in Delaware, but their operational headquarters is in Toronto. Their primary business is rare earth mineral extraction in developing countries with minimal environmental oversight. And now they were trying to establish operations on the U.S. East Coast by hiding behind luxury development," Sullivan added. "Clever. Evil, but clever." Karen tapped the geological survey map spread on the table. "The mineral deposits extend beyond your property, Mr. Harrington, but the crucial access point, both physically and for water resources, is directly through Seafoam Cottage. Without that parcel, extraction becomes prohibitively expensive, possibly unviable." The realization of how central my grandfather's property was to their entire scheme struck me anew. "So when Victor gets out on bail and can't find me, what's his next move?" Sullivan and Margaret exchanged looks. "We've requested his bail be revoked based on the new evidence and the incident at your house," Sullivan said, "but the judge hasn't ruled yet." "What aren't you telling me?" I pressed. Margaret sighed. "We've received reports that equipment is again moving towards Seafoam Cottage. Apparently, Terra Nova isn't waiting for Victor to sort things out legally." My stomach dropped. "They're going to demolish it anyway, even with the injunction?" They're desperate, Sullivan said. With these emails now in our possession, they know their entire operation is compromised. Their only play is to create that irrevocable change Victor mentioned. Destroy the property, make extraction the only logical next step. I stood abruptly. Then we need to stop them. Now, we've dispatched officers, Sullivan assured me, and filed for an emergency federal injunction based on the environmental implications. I need to be there, I insisted. It's still my property. It's too dangerous, Margaret began, but I cut her off. This is exactly what my grandfather was. Fighting to prevent. I won't hide in an office while they destroy everything he worked to protect. Karen from the EPA stood. I'll go with him. This is now a federal environmental matter, and I need to document any attempted violations. Sullivan reluctantly agreed, assigning 2 officers to accompany us. As we prepared to leave, my phone buzzed again, an unknown number. Mr. Harrington, a vaguely familiar voice. This is Edward Collins, Cape Haven town manager. There's something. You should know about your grandfather's property. I'm a little busy right now, I replied tersely. Listen carefully, he continued urgently. 5 years ago, Theodore Harrington donated a conservation easement on the northern portion of his property to the Townland Trust. It was kept quiet at his request, but it legally prevents any development or extraction on that section permanently. Another layer of my grandfather's protection strategy revealed itself. Why are you telling me this now? A pause. Because I was part of the problem. Andrea Harrington convinced the council to ignore the easement in development planning. But I can't be part of destroying our coastline. The easement documents are in the town vault. They're valid, regardless of who owns the property now. As we raced toward Cape Haven, I marveled at my grandfather's foresight. The restrictive covenant, the conservation trust, the hidden property line, and now a conservation easement. He had created layer upon layer of legal protection, knowing that any one defense might be circumvented by determined opponents with deep pockets. Night had fallen by the time we approached Seafoam. In the distance, the glow of industrial lights illuminated the property like an alien landscape. Through the trees, I could make out the silhouettes of heavy equipment. They weren't waiting. They were moving now, tonight, hoping to destroy enough that legal protections would become moot. As we rounded the final curve, the full scene came into view. Police cruisers blocking the access road, officers confronting workers, and beyond them, a bulldozer positioned alarmingly close to the boathouse. The battle for Seafoam had reached its critical moment. We arrived at Seafoam to find chaos unfolding in harsh industrial lighting. Police officers argued with construction workers, while heavy equipment idled menacingly close to the cottage. Victor Chambers directed operations despite officers attempting to intervene. Karen flashed her EPA credentials as we approached. This property is under EPA investigation due to evidence of attempted illegal resource extraction in violation of multiple federal statutes. Victor spotted me, striding over with barely contained fury. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Harrington. This goes far beyond your little cottage. I know exactly what I'm interfering with, I replied calmly. 200 million in rare earth minerals, Terra Nova's off-the-books operation. Environmental regulations circumvented through fraud. A commotion near the road drew our attention. Elise emerged from a police car, still in detention clothing, accompanied by Sullivan. Ms. Harrington has agreed to provide testimony regarding Terra Nova's operations, Sullivan announced, in exchange for considerations in her own case. You can't possibly have authorization for this, Victor blustered to Karen. Your permits were fraudulently obtained, she countered, and this property has a conservation easement registered with the Town Land Trust that specifically prohibits extraction activities. I stepped forward. My grandfather built legal fortifications you couldn't breach. The restrictive covenant, the trust with the historical society, the conservation easement, the hidden property line protecting the water rights. One old man shouldn't be able to block progress worth hundreds of millions, Victor spat. A worker approached Victor with urgent news. His expression shifted from anger to panic as he signaled toward the bulldozer to stop. Too late. It was already moving toward the boathouse. I broke into a run as officers rushed forward. From the cottage emerged Harriet Lowell and several town residents, linking arms to form a human barrier in front of the boathouse. The bulldozer operator hesitated, then cut the engine. This property is protected by the Historical Society, the Conservation Trust, town easement, and the will of this community, Harriet announced firmly. You will not destroy it today or ever. As Victor was led away in handcuffs, he hissed, "This isn't over. There are larger interests involved than you can imagine." "Maybe so," I acknowledged, "but they'll have to find another coastline to destroy. This one's protected." Standing on the porch my grandfather had rebuilt with his own hands, I finally understood what he had entrusted to me. Not just a house with a deed, but a mission, a responsibility I was now ready to fulfill. 1 month later, I sat in the federal courthouse watching Victor Chambers accept a plea deal. 15 years imprisonment for conspiracy to violate environmental regulations, wire fraud, bribery, and attempted destruction of protected property. Terra Nova Resources faced fines that would likely bankrupt the company, its stock in freefall as details of their attempted illegal extraction made international news. Dominic received 8 years, Andrea Harrington 5. Various town officials who had accepted bribes faced their own legal reckonings. Elise's cooperation earned her a reduced sentence of 3 years, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. Her testimony had been crucial in revealing connections to similar operations planned for other coastal communities. As the judge delivered the final sentencing, I felt neither joy nor satisfaction, only relief that justice had been served and that Seafoam, along with the entire coastline, was now safe. That afternoon I met with Harriet and the board of the Historical Society in Seafoam's sunroom. I slid a document across the table. "I'm transferring 40% ownership of Seafoam to the Historical Society," I explained. "The main house will remain private, but the grounds, boathouse and studio will be open to the public on scheduled days." "Ryan, this is incredibly generous," Harriet said. "Are you certain?" My grandfather understood that places like this belong to more than just one person. The Historical Society already held a stake through the Conservation Trust. This just formalizes that relationship. I revealed a second document. "I'm also establishing the Theodore Harrington Coastal Conservation Fund with the settlement money from Terra Nova. It will provide grants for environmental protection along the Cape Haven shoreline." Later, as everyone departed, I stood alone on the bluff overlooking the ocean. My phone buzzed. The divorce was finalized. After 15 years, my marriage to Elise was officially over. I felt a pang of sadness for what might have been, for the genuine moments we had shared amidst the deception. But there was no anger left, just acceptance and readiness to move forward. As I turned back towards Seafoam, I realized that while the deed might list my name, the true ownership of this place was something far more complex. A web of community, history, and shared responsibility that would long outlast any single caretaker, just as my grandfather had intended all along. 1 year later, I stood on Seafoam's porch, watching visitors explore the grounds, now featuring educational placards about coastal ecosystems. Every Saturday, the property opened to the public. The studio transformed into a gallery, showcasing my grandfather's seascapes alongside local artists' work. The boathouse had become an environmental education center where school groups learned about conservation. The Harrington Fund had already sponsored 3 major restoration projects along the shoreline. Inside, Seafoam remained my sanctuary, though changed. I'd converted the dining room into a writing space where I documented not just the drama and betrayal, but the deeper story of one man's determination to protect something precious. Margaret visited often, as did William Porter, now the unofficial historian of the Seafoam standoff. Harriet brought historical society matters for discussion over tea. Adam had moved to Cape Haven permanently, working as the Conservation Fund's security consultant. Life had found a new rhythm, different from what I'd imagined but somehow more authentic. The cottage that had nearly been stolen had become the center of a community I hadn't known I needed. That evening, after visitors departed, Adam brought me a package from Margaret, a weathered journal containing my grandfather's private thoughts. During his final year, the last entry read, "Seafoam has taught me what it means to be a steward rather than an owner. We don't possess beautiful things. We protect them for those who will come after us." Ryan understands this, I think, though perhaps not yet fully. He will. When the time comes, he will recognize that the true value of this place has nothing to do with property values. Some things cannot be bought or sold. They can only be preserved through vigilance and love. Outside, locals gathered on the beach for the sunset, a tradition that had sprung up in recent months. Among them were faces I now knew well: the fisherman who brought fresh catch, the teacher who volunteered at the education center, the couple who had named their newborn Theodore after the man who saved Cape Haven. They waved, and I waved back, no longer surprised by the connection I felt. My wife had tried to sell Seafoam, never understanding that its true value couldn't be measured in dollars. In trying to take it from me, she had inadvertently led me to fully claim it, not just as property, but as legacy, as home. The deed might have my name on it, but Seafoam's soul belonged to something greater, the past that shaped it, the community that cherished it, and the future that would inherit it, just as it should be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.